All right, welcome to episode 9 of the series Start With One, where I'm teaching you how to how to do web development from the very beginning with no coding experience necessary. If you've missed any episodes, or if you're just getting in on this video as the first time that you've seen this series, if you go down to the description in the video, there's a link back to the playlist, and you can just start with episode number 1. We're sort of building you up to this point. If you want to stick around and watch this, that's fine. And for those who have been with the series since episode 1, I think you'll begin to see that we're starting to get into bigger areas, and we're going to start moving toward building something a little bit more real. So at this point, we've learned a lot of the HTML tools, and now we're going to learn how to take those tools and we're going to shape them into begin to shape them into something more meaningful. It's a little bit like saying, oh, I know how to use paint and paint brushes and the tools to do a painting, so I should know how to paint a picture that should be, good, noticeable, that there's some skill there. You will be able to use the tools, but there are some sort of things about composition. There's some things about putting things together into the right places and using the right things in order to structure the website that you don't get just by having the tools. You can put things on the page, but we're going to talk today about something called semantics. And semantics is just, you may hear people say that that's just a matter of semantics, right? It's a matter of meaning, what you mean, or, it's just a small thing. But in web development, semantics is a huge deal because there's no other way to create meaning inside of a document than to use the tools that we have. And so with HTML5, thankfully, we finally got some more tools to be able to mark up our pages meaningfully, as opposed to just marking them up using the tools that we have. So we have sort of some groupings and things like that that we can use, that when a screen reader comes to our page, or when we're talking about search engine optimization, the search engine robot is looking through our page, and they can really read the page and get meaning out of the page, which is what makes when you do a web search, that's what makes your web search so effective, is that not only is it reading the actual content of the page, but it's reading the meaning of the content, the intended meaning. And it's not having to parse that out or try to figure out what the meaning is. It's being told, this is what this means. This is this section inside this section inside this section. So it's super helpful for search engine, being found in Google search or Yahoo or Bing or whatever it is. All of them have robots that are reading your page. So let's get into the main parts of semantic structure and structuring a document. And the first one is going to be called header. Now, when I'm writing these out, they have opening and closing tags, and so everything that goes in between here is going to be considered a part of the header. Okay, so this is normally how we would write that, and then all of our the header, typically it's usually a big strip across the top. It includes the logo, navigation, search. Sometimes you see social media icons in there. Sometimes you see contact information, links to shopping carts, all that stuff that goes across sort of the top of the page. That's considered a header. And typically when you see the first header on a page, that's going to be content that gets sort of passed along from page to page. It's the same on most of your pages. And so header is the first one. So let's get that in there. And the next one is nav. Now nav is for navigation. So inside of this, the screen reader or the robot knows, okay, this is navigation for the website, for the page. Sometimes you'll see this inside of the header. Maybe there's a logo on one side and a navigation on the right. And then you might put a class on there that says main navigation, or an ID that says main nav, or something like that, that gives even more information about not just is it a navigation, but what is the navigation specifically for. So you can give it even more meaning if you want to. The next the next one is called main. It's typically good practice to only use main once. You can use headers, navs, sections, articles, all those things multiple times on a more complex page, but typically you only want to use main once, because that's it's denoting that this is the main content of the page. So if you have like a 3-column layout with maybe your main navigation over here, and then a center section where you have your blog posts or your document text, and then you have another like small sidebar to the right with, let's say, advertising in it. Your main should be the center section. So wherever your main content for the page is, that's what should be wrapped in this main. That way, if a user wants to just sort of flip through, tab through the different parts of your page, let's say they're not a sighted user, and so they're using keyboard shortcuts to get through your page, you want them to be able to find the main content and to be able to get to that main content quickly. And if you mark your main content with main, then it would be very easy for them to be able to just simply move through to the main content. We can use a sidebar. Sidebar is typically exactly what you think. I'm sorry, this should be an aside. What I'm thinking, but you can use asides for sidebars. So aside is one of the main HTML types that we can use as well. An aside is typically used for a sidebar. So as opposed to the main, the aside is not main content. It's sort of connected to the main content, but it's not necessarily the main content itself. This is often put inside of the main, so that you have sort of a sidebar with another larger context. Sometimes it's not, like in our example, you might have an aside over here as our main sidebar, and then you'll have main for your content, and then you'll have another aside over here for another sidebar. So that's one of the ways that you could do that. Inside of our main content, you'll often see these particular tags. One is called the section. One is called the article. And we'll just stick with those for now, and we'll cover a couple of others in just a moment. But the section and the article are ways of grouping together pieces of information. So sometimes when you're talking about semantics, it's really hard to it's a little hard to understand conceptually where you would use it, because there's a lot of freedom to sort of use them anywhere. What you want to ask yourself is, let's say for a section, it's about grouping together a part of the page that is like one piece of functionality, like a group of article headlines, and it's like pieces of information that you wouldn't say, oh, that's an article or a post, but it's a groups of information that you want to keep together, but you wouldn't necessarily say that's an article. I can tell what that is. Now for the article, you would look at that and you would say, oh, okay, a blog post is like a magazine article. It's like a newspaper article. So I understand that I can wrap this blog post inside of an article tag, and that makes sense to me. A lot of this is just sort of common sense and making sense of the information that's on the page. So an article could be defined as a block of related content that makes sense on its own without the rest of the page. So if you had our example where there's a sidebar and main content and another sidebar, that main content doesn't need the sidebars necessarily. So inside that main section you might have 10 articles, and each of those articles sort of makes sense just on their own. If everything was taken off the page except for what's inside of each article, it would make sense. So you just kind of have to work with it a little bit, I guess, and sort of figure things out. And then the last of the main tags that we're going to use for semantics, at least, is called the footer. And a footer is similar to a header. So you see the header's at the top of the page, the footer is going to be at the bottom of the page. Often this has copyright information, maybe the logo, information about the company. There might be navigation, like navigation that's not considered the main navigation for the website, but maybe there are other internal pages you want people to be able to get to quickly that you don't necessarily want to put into the header. There could be a search field down there. There could be social media links. There could be an email sign-up form, like a small form that you can sign up to an email list. Okay, all that stuff would be put in the footer. It's sort of your last chance to be able to catch that person on the page. And also remember that whatever you put in the footer is going to be indexed by search engine bots who are coming to your page. So footers are really important. They're usually the same across most of the pages, and it's just a group of content at the end of the page, but you would put all that information inside of a footer wrapper. Okay, so let's talk about two more. So these are called semantic tags or wrappers, and then we have two that are non-semantic, and we talked about this in the previous video, but we'll cover it a little bit more here. The first one is called the div, and the second one is called a span. Okay, so neither of these tags has any sort of meaning in and of itself. A footer has meaning. You know that that is something at the bottom of the page. A header has meaning. You know that's something at the top of a page or a section. Nav stands for a navigation, which says anything inside this is going to be a navigation with links to go somewhere. These don't mean anything. Div is, I think, short for divider, and span is just it just encircles things so that you can target them with CSS or excuse me, or with JavaScript. So that's essentially why we use these things. So if you're looking at a section of content and you can't decide, you're like, well, it doesn't really fit into any of these semantic tags, then it's okay to use one of these non-semantic tags. Now, we talked before in the previous video about something being a block level element and something being an inline element. All of these semantic tags are block level elements. So the header, it's going to, wherever you put it, it's going to take up the full width of its container. So if it's the first thing inside the body, then it's going to go, the body should be 100% wide. So it's going to be 100% of the body. So it would take up all of this space here. So when it takes up all the space in a container, and then the next let's say it's just like this and there's a nav down here, then the nav would be pushed down to another line. There would be a carriage return from wherever the header ends to where the next element begins. It goes down to another line. And if it does that, that means it's a block level element. So p tags, block quotes, any of these semantic tags, those are all block level elements. They all take up 100% of its content, its container. Now a span is an inline element, like an A tag, like an anchor tag that we use for anchor links. That is an inline element. So if you had multiple spans next to each other, they'll just be one after another like this. They're inline block. Okay, maybe you can think about it like that. So when you wrap some text with a span, this doesn't push this content here, doesn't get pushed down to the next line. It stays all in a line, and then you are just able to sort of target or style this particular text right here, but it doesn't break the sentence. Now if you had the same thing with a P or a div, well we'll just use a div here. So if you had this same text, which is gobbledygook text, but if you had this same text in a div, this section here would be on one line, and then once it got here, it would actually push it down to the next line like this, because this div is taking up the full amount of the space on the page, which you should be able to see. Okay. I'm just going to create a false return here. Okay. So this is our first line of text. That's this part here with the div, and the div is taking up this section. You can see that's this section here, and then it's creating a carriage return to push this next piece of text down, so that even if we removed all the space, I was just showing you what it would look like. So even if we remove all the space, we're going to get the same setup. You can see I've refreshed it and we get the same thing. So even though it's in line here, up here where it shows and displays on the page, this is actually going to be pushed down to another line. And you can see with our span, nothing gets pushed down. So we could target this and we can make it, let's say, red if we wanted to. And then that would affect only what's inside the span, and the rest of the sentence is not affected, but it also doesn't break the sentence down to another line. So that's how inline versus block elements work. And it's a really important concept because sometimes you don't want to break the line, and sometimes you do want to break the line. Inline elements. Also things when we start talking about building in margin or padding, things like that, where we're using the box model, it doesn't work with an inline element. So you have to turn that inline element through CSS into a block element, or there's something called inline block, which it's sort of both of those things put together, so you can control the spacing around it, but it doesn't break the line. So that's something we'll get into more as we get into CSS. That's sort of some of the baseline things to think about in CSS. But when we're putting our HTML together, we'll just have to remember that anytime we have a span or anytime we have an A tag, so an A tag is also an inline element. So these are just sort of important things to remember when we're looking at these things. So let's say we have some link here. Let's let you in on a little secret. A lot of developers use #0 for their links. So you can see here that we have all this stuff and we have it marked up, but because the A tag is inline, it doesn't actually push it down to another line. And if we come down and we make this a div surrounding the A tag, now it's going to create a carriage return, and this link should wind up on this bottom part. So you can see that it created a return there. Okay, so that's just because now this link is taking up this entire section here, instead of only taking up as much space as is inside of this as the text is. So when it's inline, it's only taking up the amount of space it takes to write some link. Okay, so hopefully that is understandable for you. And we're going to be using semantic tags in order to create sections for our website. And inside those sections, then we'll use things like headers, and we'll even nest some of these elements too. So you could have an article inside of a section, and then a section inside of an article, and then another article inside of that section. So you can sort of nest these things, because you're looking at the groups of content and you're saying, what does this content mean? And then let me wrap it with this semantic meaning, so that when someone comes by and looks at this code, they can say, oh, this is an article, and I can easily and quickly understand what is inside of this block of text. All right, semantics has something that is relatively new, probably 5 to 7 years new inside of HTML. We've been thinking about it for a long time. You used to have to do a lot of like special things to tell people, this div means this or this div means that, and that was really these divs are all we really had for a long time to be able to create block level elements. And so now we have something that means a little bit more, that we can just use right out of the box. We don't have to do any special formatting or labeling or anything like that we used to have to do in order to make this more semantic. Let's do 2 more basic elements that we have not covered. One I showed you here, which is called a break, and that's essentially a carriage return. If you're familiar with typewriters, if you're as old as I am, I learned how to type on a typewriter, by the way, electric typewriter. So a carriage return is interesting because instead of it creates one line break. Okay, so we've seen that here. Now if we come and we say, if we put 2 of these BRs together, so a break followed by a break, and we save that, you can see that there will be another line here. Okay, so we've created one break that pushes this text here down one line, and then we've created another break which pushes it down another line. So we've essentially created a space here, because this is 2 breaks, so 1 break and 2 breaks. If we remove that, you can see that all of this is going to come back up here. So without our breaks, nothing happens here. And then with our breaks, then we get 2 lines. Okay, you can see how that works. Here's again with just 1 line break. So that's just 1 carriage return. So you can think about that as a carriage return. So 1, 2. And the other one is called, well, after this, we could separate our 2 sections there with what's called a horizontal rule. And a horizontal rule is just a horizontal line, and it would put a line between these 2 things. Now, and HR has a little bit of styling already through the browser, so you can see there's a little bit of I don't know if it's margin or padding on either side of it, but it gives you a little bit of separation between them. So this is called a horizontal rule, and you can use HRs in order to separate content as well. Same way you would do in graphic design or any other design field. You can use horizontal rules to sort of group or separate content. Horizontal rules. um, we don't necessarily need them as much as we used to. This used to be the only way that you could get those lines really like that. And so we would use them to separate content. But now through CSS, we could put boxes around things. We can do lines on one side of our content. We can do borders. So there's a lot of different things that we can do with CSS to be able to section our content off. We could give one of these an entirely different background than the other, and that would help to set it off. So there's a lot of things that we can do now to visually sort of make separation that we don't have to necessarily put these things inside of our HTML, and it tends to junk up your HTML. And it's easier to make changes always to the CSS than it is to make changes to your HTML, especially when your site gets big. That's the whole reason that CSS exists, is to be able to make changes to many things very easily. So putting another element in here, this is mostly a style element at this point, and so we don't typically style things inside the HTML. We use HTML for structure. Think of it as the bones of your document, and think of the skin as more of the CSS side. So what does it look like? How do things get sectioned off? What things are different? What color are things? And then you think of the JavaScript as sort of the muscles which help your body move, and they create interaction. That's what JavaScript does for your website. It puts it in motion and makes it move. So that's one of the best explanations I've heard, is thinking about it in terms of the major systems of the body. And you got three major parts: the skeletal system, the muscular system, and then you have skin, hair, like all, your skin is an organ, and then you have all of the things that you can see, the color of your eyes, and the size and shape of your hands and your feet or your arms. That sort of stuff is kind of defined by the CSS, and that's what people interact with. We don't interact with your organs. We interact with your skin. We interact with the outside of your body. We see you. Okay, so that's what the CSS is. So maybe that's helpful to you as we begin to make a transition not too long from now into CSS, to help you understand what we're doing. Okay. Excuse me. I think in the next video we'll start to hold on and get a little water. I think in the next video we'll start to plan and consider what is our website going to look like, because if we just get in there and we start doing stuff, it's going to take longer, and it's not going to be quite as organized as we want it to be. And even though this is going to be sort of a basic one-page website that has your profile information and stuff, just to think about, what do I want people to know? So we got to start asking some questions about content, and this is going to serve us well if we know what the content is before we start writing the HTML. That's really going to help us. So let's take the body example. If you don't know what the person, let's say you're building a person, right? And you need to know, it would be helpful to know this person has to run fast, or this person has to lift heavy things, or this person has to live in cold weather, or this person has to be able to sit for a long time. If you knew those kinds of things before you were building the person, it would help you to accent and to build the structure of the person. So if you needed somebody who needed to be able to lift things, heavy things, you would build a person differently than if you needed a person who needed to run fast. So knowing sort of what the person is going to do, knowing what the end game is, so to speak, then that helps you to build out from the very beginning to build your code and to sort of focus it in that direction toward being able to do particular things. So knowing your audience, knowing the content that needs to be on there, all of these things are going to help you to not have to go back and just be rewriting your code all the time. You'll have a really good sense of how the code needs to be laid out before you get there. Because maybe you don't need a header. Maybe you don't need a footer. Maybe you don't need, maybe there's no articles per se, and you only need to build it out with sections. So these are just things to consider. Maybe you don't need a sidebar necessarily. So we'll think about these things, and we'll think about different types of layouts, and we'll think about how to arrange everything on the page and what makes sense. And we'll do that with probably just pen and paper. We'll look at some examples of personal profile pages, and then we'll start to build and look at our content, decide what's going to be on there, and then build out our own personal profile pages. All right. If you have any questions about semantics, or you have any questions about what I'm putting on here as far as block level or inline level elements, sometimes at the beginning it can be confusing. So if you have any questions, leave them in the comments section below. I'm happy to get to them as quickly as I can. And I appreciate you following along with this series. If you haven't subscribed to the channel already, then if you do, you'll get notifications of each time when I'm posting new videos. And this is going to be a pretty long series, so and I'm not going to post necessarily every day. So rather than having to come back and check all the time, you can get notifications in your inbox, or if you click the bell, you can get notifications all the time of every video that I post. And the majority of them for a while will probably be along these lines, but sometimes I post about other web development topics, or techniques and tutorials and stuff like that. So I'd appreciate the subscription, but also it's for you. So if you want to keep up with the series, then you'll be able to do that really easily. You can follow me on Twitter. My name is Brian Hafferkamp, and so my Twitter handle is @BrianHafferkamp, and you can look me up on Twitter, BRIAN. And I'm happy to connect with you there. I've connected with several people about different things that they're doing. And what else is there? I think that's it for now. I don't have any other things about the semantics. These are our basic sort of building blocks, larger building blocks that we're going to put things inside of in order to create our page. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.